The cards fell like death sentences across the green felt table, and Fletcher Moss knew before the last one landed that he had just wagered everything he owned against a rancher who never lost. The saloon in Lusk, Wyoming had gone silent as a tomb, 50 pairs of eyes watching as the man across from him, Harold Caldwell, laid down a full house with the kind of cold smile that said he had known the outcome before the first card was dealt. Fletcher's throat went dry as sand. The deed to his small cattle operation, his horses, his land, everything his father had worked himself into an early grave to build, now belonged to a man who collected properties the way other men collected scalps. "Well now," Harold said, his voice carrying across the hushed room like the crack of a whip. "Seems like I own myself another spread. That makes 5 ranches this year alone." He reached for the deed that lay in the center of the table, his thick fingers already closing around it. Fletcher's hand shot out, covering the paper before Harold could take it. His heart hammered against his ribs, desperation making him reckless. "One more hand," he said, his voice rough. "Give me a chance to win it back." Harold leaned back in his chair, studying Fletcher with the kind of interest a cat gives a mouse before the final pounce. "And what exactly would you bet, boy? You just gave me everything you own." The question hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. Fletcher's mind raced. He had nothing left, nothing except his pride, his skill with horses and the clothes on his back. Around them, men began to whisper, placing their own bets on what the young cowboy might offer up. Someone laughed, a harsh sound that cut through the tension. Then the door to the saloon opened, letting in a blast of October wind that carried the scent of dust and approaching winter. Fletcher turned his head along with everyone else, and his breath caught in his chest. The woman who stepped through that doorway looked like she had been carved from determination and firelight. Her hair, the color of honey touched by sunset, had come loose from its pins during what must have been a hard ride, falling in waves around a face that combined strength with an undeniable beauty. She wore a riding dress the color of deep forest green, dusty from travel, and her eyes, green as spring grass, swept the room with a directness that made several men look away. But it was not her appearance that stopped the room cold. It was the way she carried herself, like she had already decided the world could either step aside or get trampled, and she did not much care which. "Father," she said, her voice clear and sharp as breaking ice, "we need to talk. Now." Harold Caldwell's face went through several changes at once: surprise, anger, and something that might have been fear, though Fletcher could not imagine what this man would have to fear from anyone, even a woman who clearly shared his blood. The resemblance was there in the set of the jaw, the width of the cheekbones, though everything harsh in Harold's features had been refined into something striking in his daughter. "Hannah," Harold said, standing so quickly his chair scraped against the wooden floor. "What in blazes are you doing here? You are supposed to be in Cheyenne with your aunt." "I was in Cheyenne," Hannah said, moving through the crowd of men like a ship cutting through water. They parted for her automatically. "Until I received a very interesting letter from Thomas Burke, your lawyer, who apparently has more conscience than you do. He told me about your little hobby of gambling men out of their livelihoods." Harold's face flushed dark red. "That is business, girl, and none of your concern." "It became my concern when I learned you have been using my inheritance to fund your games," Hannah shot back. She had reached the table now, standing directly across from her father with Fletcher sitting between them like a man caught in the crossfire of a range war. "The money my mother left to me. The money you have been dipping into without my knowledge or consent." The silence in the saloon had changed quality, becoming charged with a different kind of tension. Fletcher watched Harold's hands curl into fists on the table, saw the muscle jump in his jaw. But before Harold could respond, Hannah's gaze shifted to Fletcher, really looking at him for the first time. Her eyes were extraordinary up close, green with flecks of gold that caught the lamplight. They studied him with an intensity that made him feel exposed, like she could see straight through to his bones. "What did he take from you?" she asked, and there was something in her voice that sounded almost gentle, though Fletcher suspected gentle was not a word often applied to this woman. "My ranch," Fletcher said, finding his voice. 300 acres of grazing land, a herd of 40 head, and a house my father built with his own hands before fever took him 2 years back. Hannah's expression did not change, but something flickered in her eyes. She looked back at her father. "And how much of my money did you use to stay in the game?" Harold's silence was answer enough. Hannah nodded once, sharp as a blade. "Then it seems to me that makes this my game as much as yours." She pulled out the chair next to Fletcher and sat down in it, her skirts rustling. Around the room, men began to murmur, shocked whispers spreading like wildfire. A decent woman did not sit at a gambling table. A decent woman did not challenge her father in public. A decent woman certainly did not look Harold Caldwell in the eye the way Hannah was doing now, without a trace of fear. "You cannot be serious," Harold said, his voice dangerously low. "I am perfectly serious," Hannah replied. "You want another hand, fine, but I am going to play it." She looked at Fletcher again. "If we win, you get your ranch back and my father stops this insanity. If we lose," she paused, and for the first time Fletcher saw something flicker across her face that might have been doubt. "If we lose, I will marry whomever my father chooses and never speak another word against his business dealings." The words hit Fletcher like a physical blow. He stared at her, this woman he had known for all of 5 minutes, who was offering to gamble away her entire future for a stranger. "Madam," he said carefully, "you do not have to do this." Hannah turned to him, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet enough that only he could hear. "Yes, I do. My father has been destroying lives for his own profit while spending money that belonged to my mother, money she wanted used to help people, not hurt them. This ends tonight, one way or another." Fletcher looked into those fierce green eyes and saw the kind of courage most men would never possess in a lifetime. He also saw the trap she was walking into. "You understand what you are offering up, your freedom, your life." "I understand perfectly," Hannah said. She extended her hand to him across the table. "Are you with me, Mr. Moss?" Fletcher supplied. "Fletcher Moss." He took her hand, felt the calluses on her palm that said she was no stranger to hard work despite her fine dress, felt the warmth of her skin against his. "And yes, madam, I am with you." Harold was staring at his daughter like he had never seen her before. "Hannah, I will not allow this." "You do not have a choice," Hannah said, not breaking eye contact with Fletcher. "Unless you want me to stand up right now and tell every man in this room exactly how you have been operating, how many families you have ruined, how many deeds you hold that were won with money that legally belongs to me." I doubt the territorial judge would look too kindly on that, especially since half these men have wives who would love an excuse to run you out of town. Fletcher watched Harold's face carefully, saw the moment the older man realized his daughter had him cornered. It was almost impressive, the way Hannah had walked into a room full of hard men and turned the entire situation on its head in less than 10 minutes. She released Fletcher's hand and turned to the dealer, a nervous-looking man with sweat beading on his forehead. "Well," she said, "are you going to deal, or do we need to find someone else?" The dealer looked at Harold, who gave a tight nod. The man began shuffling the cards with hands that shook slightly. Fletcher felt his pulse hammering in his throat. Everything depended on this. Not just his ranch now, but this woman's entire future. The weight of that responsibility sat on his chest like a boulder. 5-card draw, the dealer announced, his voice cracking slightly. Best hand wins. Hannah leaned close to Fletcher, her shoulder brushing his. She smelled like sage and wind and something sweet he could not quite identify. "Have you ever played with a partner before?" she whispered. "No, madam," Fletcher admitted. "Then let me tell you a secret my mother taught me," Hannah said, her breath warm against his ear. "Cards are just pieces of paper. The real game is watching the man across the table, learning to read what is behind his eyes. And I have been reading my father's tells since I was 6 years old." The dealer laid out 5 cards face down in front of Harold, then 5 in front of Fletcher and Hannah. Fletcher reached for his cards, but Hannah's hand stopped him again, gentle but firm on his wrist. "Wait," she breathed. "Watch him first." Fletcher forced himself to stillness, to ignore the cards burning there on the table and instead study Harold Caldwell. The man picked up his cards slowly, fanning them out. His face remained impassive, but Fletcher saw it, the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his thumb rubbed against the edge of one card, twice, then stopped. Hannah made a small sound, barely audible, then nodded at Fletcher. Together they picked up their cards. Fletcher looked down at his hand and felt his heart sink. A pair of 7s. Nothing else. Absolutely nothing to work with. He glanced at Hannah, trying to keep his expression neutral, and saw her studying their cards with fierce concentration. "We would like 3 cards," she announced. The dealer slid 3 new cards across the felt. Fletcher picked them up, trying not to let hope or despair show on his face. A jack, a 4, and a 9. Still nothing. Just a pair of 7s against whatever Harold was holding. Around them, the crowd had pressed closer, men standing on chairs to see, the air thick with cigar smoke and tension. "And you, Mr. Caldwell?" the dealer asked. Harold's eyes never left his daughter's face. "I will keep what I have." A murmur ran through the crowd. Keeping all 5 cards meant Harold believed he had a winning hand as dealt. Fletcher felt the last shred of hope draining away. There was no way a pair of 7s would beat whatever Harold was holding. But when he looked at Hannah, she was smiling, just a small curve of her lips that did not reach her eyes. "Show your cards, father," she said quietly. Harold laid them down with deliberate care. 3 queens and a pair of 8s. A full house, just like the last hand. The crowd erupted, some men cheering, others groaning as side bets were won and lost. Fletcher felt the world narrowing down to a single point of crushing disappointment. They had lost. He had lost his ranch forever, and worse, this brave, fierce woman had just gambled away her freedom for nothing. But Hannah was still smiling. "An excellent hand," she said to her father. "There is just one problem." She reached out and plucked one of the queens from Harold's cards, holding it up to the light. For a moment, Fletcher did not understand what he was seeing. Then Hannah angled the card just right, and he saw it. A tiny mark on the back, barely visible, a slight discoloration in the pattern. "You are cheating," Hannah said, her voice carrying across the sudden hush that had fallen over the room. "You have been marking cards." Everything happened at once. Harold lunged across the table, reaching for his daughter, but Fletcher was faster. He stood up so quickly his chair flew backwards, putting himself between Hannah and her father. Men surged forward from all directions, some grabbing Harold, others examining the cards on the table with increasing anger. Fletcher heard someone shout about checking the deck, heard the dealer protesting that he did not know, that Harold had provided the cards himself. Hannah stood beside Fletcher, calm in the center of the storm, and pulled something from the pocket of her dress. It was a letter, worn from being folded and unfolded many times. "Thomas Burke did not just tell me about the money," she said. loud enough to be heard over the chaos. "He told me about the cards, too. He has been keeping track, Father. Evidence. Dates, games, witnesses. He was prepared to go to the law, but I convinced him to let me handle it first, to give you one chance to make things right." Harold had stopped struggling against the men who held him. He was staring at his daughter with something that looked like betrayal, like he could not comprehend how his own blood could turn on him this way. "Hannah," he said, and his voice had lost all its command, becoming almost plaintive. "Everything I did for us, to build something." "You did it for yourself," Hannah said, and now Fletcher could hear the pain underneath the steel in her voice. "Mother would be ashamed. She left that money to help people, not to fund your games and feed your pride." She turned to the crowd. "Every deed my father holds, won in card games over the past 3 years, I am offering to return to their rightful owners. The money he used was mine by legal right, which means those games were played under false pretenses. Any man who wants his property back can see Thomas Burke in Cheyenne with proof of ownership." The roar that went up nearly lifted the roof off the saloon. Men were shouting, some crying openly, others demanding to know where they could find this lawyer. Fletcher stood in the middle of it all, trying to process what had just happened. Hannah had not just saved his ranch. She had saved dozens of them. She had walked into a room full of strangers and overturned her father's entire operation with nothing but courage and her mother's money. When he looked at her, she was swaying slightly on her feet, the color draining from her face. Without thinking, Fletcher put his arm around her waist, steadying her. She looked up at him, and he saw that the fierce determination had given way to exhaustion and something that looked like grief. "Thank you," she whispered. "I did not do anything," Fletcher said, confused. "You did it all." "You stood between me and him," Hannah said. "When he lunged at me, you did not even hesitate. You have no idea how long it has been since anyone protected me instead of assuming I do not need it." Her hand came up to rest on his chest, just over his heart, and Fletcher felt that light touch all the way through his body. "What happens now?" Fletcher became aware that they were standing very close, that he was still holding her, that the entire saloon was watching them with interest. He should step back, put proper distance between them. Instead, he found himself saying, "Now I get my ranch back, thanks to you. And you need somewhere to stay that is not anywhere near your father. Seems like those two problems might have the same solution." Hannah blinked up at him, surprise chasing across her features. "Are you offering me shelter, Mr. Moss?" "Fletcher," he corrected. "And yes, I suppose I am. It is not much, just a ranch house that needs work and a lot of open sky, but it is honest and you would be safe there." He hesitated, then added, "And it seems like I owe you a debt I could not repay in 10 lifetimes." "I do not want repayment," Hannah said. She was studying his face like she was trying to memorize it, those green eyes searching his. "But I would very much like somewhere to stay that is not a hotel room, and somewhere to be that is not under my father's control." She glanced over at Harold, who was being escorted out of the saloon by the sheriff, a tall man with a drooping mustache who had appeared at some point during the chaos. "I think I just burned that bridge pretty thoroughly." "Good," Fletcher said, and meant it. "A man who would cheat at cards is not someone you want in your life, blood or not." Hannah laughed, a sound that was half exhaustion and half relief. "You have a very direct way of looking at things, Fletcher Moss. Life's too short for anything else," Fletcher said. He finally, reluctantly, released her waist and stepped back a half pace. "Can you ride? It is about an hour to my place." "I rode here from Cheyenne," Hannah pointed out. "I think I can manage an hour." But she swayed again, and Fletcher realized she must have been riding for days, probably barely stopping to sleep, driven by fury and determination to confront her father. "When did you last eat?" he asked. Hannah opened her mouth, then closed it again, clearly trying to remember. That was all the answer Fletcher needed. He turned to the bartender, a broad man with arms like tree trunks, and raised his voice to be heard over the ongoing celebration. "Can we get some food wrapped up to travel? For the lady who just saved half the ranchers in this county," the bartender called back. "You can have anything in the kitchen, and it is on the house." 20 minutes later, Fletcher and Hannah stepped out of the saloon into the cool October night, carrying a bundle of food and accompanied by the cheers of grateful men. Fletcher's horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Copper, was still tied at the rail where he had left him, what felt like a lifetime ago but had actually been less than 2 hours. Next to Copper stood a beautiful gray mare with intelligent eyes and a saddle worth more than most men earned in a year. "Yours?" Fletcher asked, nodding at the mare. "Athena," Hannah confirmed, running her hand down the horse's neck with obvious affection. "She has been with me since I was 17. My mother bought her for me right before." She stopped, the sentence hanging unfinished in the air. Fletcher did not push. Instead, he helped Hannah mount, making sure she was steady in the saddle before swinging up onto Copper. The town of Lusk was quiet around them, most folks already asleep for the night, the excitement contained to the saloon. Above them, stars stretched from horizon to horizon, so many they looked like someone had spilled diamonds across black velvet. The air smelled like coming winter, that sharp, clean scent that promised frost and long nights. They rode in silence for the first mile, letting the horses find their pace, the only sounds the creak of leather and the rhythmic clop of hooves on the dirt road. Fletcher kept glancing over at Hannah, checking to make sure she was steady, but she sat her saddle like she had been born to it, her back straight despite her obvious exhaustion. In the moonlight, with her hair streaming behind her and her face turned toward the stars, she looked almost otherworldly, like some kind of avenging spirit come down to set things right. "You are staring," Hannah said without looking at him, but there was amusement in her voice. Fletcher felt heat rise in his face, grateful for the darkness that hid his blush. "Sorry, just trying to figure you out." "And have you succeeded?" Now she did turn to look at him, one eyebrow raised in challenge. "Not even a little bit," Fletcher admitted. "You are the most confusing woman I ever met. You walk into a room full of rough men like you own the place. You gamble your whole future on a hand of cards for a stranger. You take down your own father without batting an eye. And then you accept an invitation to an isolated ranch from a man you just met. None of it makes a lick of sense." Hannah laughed, a real laugh this time, full and genuine. "When you put it that way, I suppose it does sound a bit mad. But here is the thing, Fletcher Moss. I have spent the last 3 years living under my father's rules, being the perfect daughter, wearing the right dresses, saying the right things, letting him control every aspect of my life because I thought that was what family meant. Loyalty. Obedience. Then I found out what he was really doing with my mother's money, with her legacy, and something just broke inside me. I realized I had been letting fear make my decisions. Fear of being alone, fear of disappointing him, fear of not being proper or respectable or whatever other nonsense society says a woman should be. So I decided to stop being afraid." "Just like that?" Fletcher asked. "Just like that," Hannah confirmed. "I got on Athena and I rode for 3 days straight, and with every mile, I felt lighter. Like I was shedding all these expectations that had been weighing me down. By the time I walked into that saloon tonight, I was not Harold Caldwell's obedient daughter anymore. I was just Hannah making my own choices for better or worse." Fletcher absorbed this, turning her words over in his mind, and accepting my invitation. That was Hannah making her own choice. "Yes," Hannah said simply. "I looked at you and I saw someone who stood up when it mattered." Someone who put himself between me and danger without being asked. Someone who looked at me like I was a real person, not just a piece of property or a problem to be solved. That seemed like someone worth trusting, at least for one night. Something warm unfurled in Fletcher's chest at her words. Something that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the way she was looking at him right now. Open and honest in the moonlight. He cleared his throat, searching for something to say that would not sound completely foolish, but before he could find the words, Hannah spoke again. "Tell me about your ranch," she said. "What is it like?" Fletcher relaxed slightly, grateful for the change of subject. 300 acres of the prettiest land you ever saw, tucked up against the foothills where the grass stays green most of the year. My father found it 20 years ago when this territory was still wild, more wild than it is now anyway. He built the house himself, cut every log, laid every stone for the fireplace. It took him 2 years, working every day from sunup to sundown. My mother said she fell in love with him watching him build that house, seeing how much care he put into every detail. "Where is your mother now?" Hannah asked gently. "She passed when I was 15, Fletcher said. The old grief was there, familiar as an old coat. Pneumonia. One day she was fine, laughing and singing while she worked. 3 days later she was gone. Father never really recovered. He kept the ranch going, but his heart was not in it anymore. When the fever took him 2 years back, I think part of him was relieved. He wanted to be with her again." "I am sorry," Hannah said, and the simple sincerity in her voice made Fletcher's throat tighten. "My mother died 3 years ago. Cancer. We watched her fade away for months, getting weaker and weaker. Near the end, she made me promise to use her money to help people, to make sure her life meant something beyond just being Harold Caldwell's wife. I thought I was honoring that promise by being a good daughter, by supporting my father, but he twisted everything. He took her legacy and used it to feed his own greed." "You stopped him," Fletcher pointed out. "Tonight, you did exactly what she asked. You helped people. You gave them back what was stolen." Hannah was quiet for a long moment, and when Fletcher looked over he saw tears tracking down her cheeks, silver in the moonlight, but she was smiling too. "I never thought of it that way," she said. "Thank you." They crested a rise, and Fletcher felt his heart lift the way it always did at this spot. Below them, bathed in moonlight, lay his valley, his ranch. The house sat nestled against a line of cottonwood trees, their leaves golden even in the darkness. Beyond it, he could see the shapes of his cattle, dark shadows against darker grass. A creek wound through the property, catching the light like a ribbon of silver. It was not much compared to some of the big spreads, but it was his, bought with his father's sweat and his own dreams. "There," he said, pointing. "That is home." Hannah had gone still beside him. When he looked at her, she was staring down at the valley with an expression he could not quite read. "It is beautiful," she said softly. "It looks like something out of a painting." "Wait until you see it in the morning," Fletcher said. "When the sun comes up over the hills and turns everything gold, that is when it really shows itself." They guided the horses down the slope toward the house. As they got closer, Fletcher began to notice things he had stopped seeing, the way the porch sagged slightly on one side, the shingles that needed replacing on the roof, the fence that wanted mending. Suddenly, his pride in the place was mixed with embarrassment. This woman had probably lived in fine houses all her life, had likely never seen anywhere as rough as this. But when they dismounted in front of the house, Hannah walked up the steps like she was coming home. She ran her hand along the porch rail, solid pine worn smooth by years of weather and use. "Your father built this?" she asked. "Every inch," Fletcher confirmed, tying the horses to the rail. He would unsaddle them properly after he got Hannah inside and settled. "He must have loved your mother very much," Hannah said. You can feel it in the bones of the place. The care, the permanence. He was building something to last. Fletcher looked at his house with new eyes, seeing it the way Hannah did. She was right. His father had built this place like he was building a legacy, something that would stand long after he was gone. And Fletcher had almost lost it, had almost let it slip away in a single hand of cards. The thought made him feel sick. "Come on," he said, unlocking the door and pushing it open. "Let us get you inside and get some food in you before you fall over." The interior of the house was simple but well made. One large main room served as kitchen, dining area, and sitting room, with a massive stone fireplace dominating one wall. 2 doors led off to bedrooms, his and what had been his parents'. Everything was clean but dusty, the kind of dust that accumulated when a man lived alone and did not see the point in worrying about such things. Fletcher found himself wishing he had thought to tidy up, though how he could have predicted this turn of events, he had no idea. Hannah walked to the center of the room and turned slowly, taking everything in. The simple furniture his father had made, the braided rug his mother had crafted, the shelves lined with books that had belonged to both of them. Her gaze lingered on a photograph sitting on the mantel, his parents on their wedding day, young and full of hope. "This is a home," she said finally. "Not just a house. A real home. You can feel the love that went into it." Fletcher busied himself lighting lamps and building up the fire, unsure how to respond to that. Once he had light and warmth going, he unwrapped the food the bartender had packed for them. Bread, cheese, cold chicken, apples. Simple fare, but Hannah fell on it like she was starving, which she probably was. Fletcher watched her eat, nursing his own piece of bread, still trying to process everything that had happened. "So what now?" he asked when Hannah had finally slowed down, looking considerably more alert. "What are your plans?" Hannah took a sip from the cup of water he had poured for her and met his eyes. "Honestly, I have no idea. I did not think beyond confronting my father and making sure he could not hurt anyone else. I suppose I need to go to Cheyenne, meet with Thomas Burke, help sort out returning all those properties. But after that," she shrugged, a gesture that tried to be casual but could not quite hide the uncertainty beneath. "I have some money of my own, enough to be independent. But I have no idea what to do with freedom now that I have it." "You could stay here," Fletcher said, then immediately wanted to kick himself. What was he thinking? He had known this woman for a few hours, but even as he thought it, he knew he meant it. The house already felt different with her in it, warmer somehow, more alive. "Just until you figure things out," he added quickly. "The spare room is yours if you want it. No obligations, no expectations, just a safe place to land for a while." Hannah studied him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "You do not know me. For all you know, I could rob you blind in the night." "You could," Fletcher agreed, "but you will not. I am a pretty good judge of character, and you are not a thief. You are someone who has been trying to do the right thing in a situation where there was no good answer. You could use a friend, and so could I." He paused, then added with complete honesty, "Besides, you saved everything I have in this world tonight. Least I can do is offer you shelter while you sort yourself out." "A friend," Hannah repeated softly, like she was testing the word. Then she smiled, and it transformed her whole face, chasing away the exhaustion and worry. "I would like that very much, Fletcher Moss. I would like to have a friend." They finished eating in comfortable silence, and then Fletcher showed Hannah to the spare room. It had been his parents' room once, before his mother died and his father moved to the smaller room, unable to sleep in the bed they had shared. Fletcher had left it largely untouched, changing the sheets regularly but otherwise keeping it as a kind of shrine to happier times. Now, Watching Hannah run her hand over the quilt his mother had made, he felt something shift inside him. Maybe it was time to let this room be used for living again instead of remembering. "There is a basin and pitcher for washing," he said, pointing. "I will bring in your saddle bags from your horse. If you need anything else, just holler. I will be right in the next room." "Fletcher," Hannah said as he turned to leave. When he looked back, she was standing in the center of the room, looking suddenly very young and very vulnerable. "Thank you for everything. For standing up for me, for offering me shelter, for not treating me like I am crazy or improper or any of the 100 other things I have been called for not behaving like a lady should." "You are the bravest person I ever met," Fletcher said simply. "Man or woman, that is not crazy. That is just being yourself." He left before she could respond, before he could do something really stupid like cross the room and take her in his arms. He had meant what he said about being friends, about no expectations. But he could not deny the pull he felt toward her, something that went beyond gratitude or attraction into territory he had never explored before. It scared him and exhilarated him in equal measure. After bringing in Hannah's bags and taking care of the horses, Fletcher lay in his own bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the small sounds of Hannah moving around in the next room. The house creaked and settled around them the way it always did, but tonight the sounds felt different. Less lonely. More like a home and less like a place where a man simply existed between dawn and dusk. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of green eyes and honey-colored hair, of a hand reaching for his across a table, of possibilities he had never let himself imagine before tonight. Morning arrived with golden light streaming through the windows, and Fletcher woke to the smell of coffee. He lay there for a confused moment, trying to figure out if he was still dreaming, then remembered. Hannah. Everything that had happened. He pulled on his clothes and emerged from his room to find Hannah standing at the stove. Her hair braided down her back, wearing the same dress as the night before, but looking considerably more rested. She was pouring coffee into 2 tin cups, moving around his kitchen like she had been doing it for years. "Morning," she said, looking up with a smile. "I hope you do not mind. I could not sleep, and I found your coffee, so I made a pot. I also let myself go through your pantry and made some bacon and eggs. I hope that was all right." "More than all right," Fletcher said, accepting the cup of coffee she handed him. He took a sip and nearly groaned. It was perfect, strong and hot and exactly what he needed. "How long have you been up?" "Couple hours," Hannah admitted. "I watched the sunrise from the porch. You were right about it. It was extraordinary." They ate breakfast together, and Fletcher found himself watching Hannah, studying the way the morning light caught in her hair, the way she moved with unconscious grace, even doing something as simple as buttering bread. She caught him staring and raised an eyebrow, but she was smiling, a small private smile that made his heart do strange things in his chest. "So," she said when they had finished eating and were lingering over second cups of coffee, "what does a day on a ranch look like?" "I have spent my whole life in cities and towns. I am embarrassed to admit I have no idea what you actually do all day." Fletcher laughed. "Well, right now, mostly I am just keeping things running until spring. Checking on the herd, making sure they have access to water and decent grazing, keeping an eye out for predators or sickness. Mending fence, maintaining equipment, cutting firewood for the winter. It is not exciting work, but it is steady." "Could I help?" Hannah asked. When Fletcher opened his mouth to protest, she held up a hand. "I am serious. I cannot just sit around your house doing nothing. I need to be useful, and I want to learn. I want to understand this life, what it means to build something with your own hands." Fletcher considered her. She was watching him with those intense green eyes, and he could see she meant every word. "All right," he he said slowly. "But we start easy. I need to ride out and check on the herd this morning, make sure none of them wandered off overnight. You can come with me if you want." Hannah's face lit up like he had offered her diamonds. "Really? I would love that." An hour later, they were mounted and riding out across the valley. The day was crystalline and perfect, the kind of October morning that made Wyoming feel like the most beautiful place on earth. The grass was still green in patches, mixed with gold where the frost had touched it. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks already dusted with snow that gleamed white against the deep blue sky. The air smelled like sage and pine and the particular sweetness of autumn. Hannah rode beside Fletcher with her face turned toward the sun, and he found himself talking more than he usually did, pointing out features of the land, explaining how the seasons changed the valley, telling stories about his cattle and his horses. She listened to everything with complete attention, asking smart questions that showed she was not just being polite but genuinely trying to understand. They found the herd spread out across a hillside, grazing peacefully. Fletcher did a quick count, checking for any sign of trouble, but everything looked good. He was about to suggest they head back when Hannah suddenly sat up straighter in her saddle, pointing toward a copse of trees near the creek. "What is that?" she asked. "That brown lump. Is that one of your cows?" Fletcher followed her gaze and felt his stomach drop. She was right. There was a cow down, and from this distance he could not tell if it was sick, injured, or worse. He kicked Copper into a canter, Hannah keeping pace beside him on Athena. As they got closer, Fletcher could see the cow was a young heifer, one he had been particularly proud of, good bloodlines and a calm temperament. She was on her side, breathing hard, clearly in distress. He dismounted quickly, approaching carefully so as not to spook her further. It only took a moment to see the problem. The heifer was trying to calve, but something was wrong. The calf was coming breech, and from the look of things she had been laboring for a while. Fletcher cursed under his breath. Without help, both the heifer and calf would die. "What is wrong?" Hannah had dismounted and was standing beside him, her face pale but her voice steady. "Calf is breech," Fletcher explained shortly. "I need to try to turn it or we will lose them both." He looked at Hannah, hating to ask but needing the help. "This is not going to be pretty. If you want to wait over by the trees, I understand. Tell me what to do," Hannah said firmly. "I am not going to stand around being useless while you try to save them." What followed was an hour of hard, messy work. Fletcher talked Hannah through helping hold the heifer steady while he reached inside, trying to feel the position of the calf and carefully manipulate it into the right position for birth. It was brutal work, made worse by the heifer's panicked bellowing and thrashing. Fletcher's arms were covered in blood up to his elbows, and he was sweating despite the cool air. But Hannah never flinched, never looked away. She held the heifer's head, talking to her in a low, soothing voice, keeping her as calm as possible while Fletcher worked. Finally, after what felt like forever, Fletcher felt the calf shift. "Got it," he gasped. "Come on, girl, come on. You can do this." He moved back, giving the heifer room, and moments later the calf slid free in a gush of fluid. For a terrible moment it lay still, and Fletcher thought they had been too late. Then the calf shuddered, coughed, and drew its first breath. The heifer, exhausted but alive, immediately began licking her baby, that ancient instinct taking over. Fletcher sat back on his heels, breathing hard, feeling the adrenaline drain away and leave him shaking. He looked over at Hannah, who was still kneeling in the grass, her dress covered in blood and birth fluid, her hair coming loose from its braid, and she was crying. But she was smiling too, watching the heifer and her calf with an expression of pure wonder. "We did it," she whispered. "They are going to be all right." "We did it," Fletcher agreed. He stood up, offering her a hand. When she took it and stood up beside him, he found he could not quite let go. They stood there for a moment, hands clasped, watching new life take its first wobbly steps into the world, and Fletcher felt something profound shift between them. This was not about a card game anymore, or gratitude, or even friendship. This was something deeper, something that had taken root in the space of a single night and was already growing towards something he could not quite name yet. Hannah must have felt it too, because when she looked up at him, her eyes were wide and wondering. "Fletcher," she started to say, but he shook his head. "Let us get them back to the barn," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "Make sure they are settled before we talk about anything else." It took most of the rest of the day to get the heifer and calf safely to the barn, cleaned up and comfortable. By the time they were done, both Fletcher and Hannah were exhausted, filthy, and starving. They washed up at the pump behind the house, the water so cold it made Fletcher's teeth ache, and Hannah laughed at his expression, splashing water at him like a child. Without thinking, he splashed her back, and suddenly they were both laughing, the tension of the day dissolving into something light and playful. That evening, they made dinner together, moving around the kitchen in a comfortable dance that should not have been possible between two people who had known each other less than 24 hours. Fletcher fried steaks, while Hannah made pan biscuits and gravy. They ate at the rough wooden table, ravenous in content, and Fletcher could not remember the last time a meal had tasted so good or a house had felt so much like a home. After dinner, they sat on the porch watching the stars come out, wrapped in blankets against the evening chill. The sky was magnificent, the Milky Way a river of light flowing overhead. Hannah sat close enough that Fletcher could feel the warmth of her shoulder against his, and they talked in soft voices about everything and nothing. She told him about growing up with a domineering father, about the mother she had lost too soon, about dreams she had never been allowed to pursue. He told her about lonely nights on the ranch, about the weight of carrying on his father's legacy alone, about wondering if this life would always be just him and the cattle and the endless sky. "I do not think you are going to be alone anymore," Hannah said quietly, and when Fletcher looked at her, she was watching him with an expression that made his breath catch. "If you do not want to be—" "I do not," Fletcher said, the words coming easier than he expected. "I do not want to be alone. And I do not want you to leave. Not tomorrow, not next week. Not unless you want to." Hannah reached over and took his hand, lacing her fingers through his. Her hand was smaller than his, calloused now from a day of hard work, and it fit against his palm like it was made to be there. "I do not want to leave," she said. "I know this is crazy. I know we just met, but I feel more at home here with you than I have felt anywhere in years. Maybe ever." Fletcher turned to face her fully, bringing his other hand up to cup her cheek. She leaned into his touch, her eyes drifting closed for a moment, and he could see the exhaustion and vulnerability beneath her usual fierce strength. This woman who had walked into a saloon and faced down her father, who had gambled her future for a stranger, who had spent hours helping deliver a calf without complaint. This extraordinary, impossible, perfect woman. "Hannah," he said, and her eyes opened, focusing on his face. "I do not know what this is or where it is going, but I know I have never felt like this before, like my whole life has been waiting for you to walk through that saloon door, and I know I want to see where this goes if you do too." "I do," Hannah breathed. "I absolutely do." Fletcher leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, but she did not. She met him halfway, and when their lips touched, it felt like coming home and setting out on an adventure all at once. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, two people learning each other. Then Hannah made a small sound in the back of her throat and pressed closer, and the kiss deepened into something that felt inevitable and right and like the beginning of everything. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Fletcher rested his forehead against hers. "Well," he said, his voice unsteady, "that is one way to complicate a friendship." Hannah laughed, the sound shaky but joyful. "I think we were past friendship the moment I sat down at that card table." "Maybe," Fletcher agreed, "but I still want to do this right, court you properly. Give you time to be sure this is what you want." "I am sure," Hannah said firmly, "but I appreciate the thought. And yes, we should probably slow down a bit, figure out the practical things. Like where I actually stand legally, and what happens with my father, and how we navigate this without everyone in 3 counties talking about the scandal." "Let them talk," Fletcher said, surprised by the fierceness in his own voice. "I do not care what people think. As long as you are here, as long as you want to be, nothing else matters." Hannah pulled back enough to look him in the eyes, and what he saw there made his heart soar. Trust, joy, the beginning of something that looked an awful lot like love. "Nothing else matters," she agreed softly. They spent the next weeks falling into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Fletcher taught Hannah everything about running a ranch, and she learned with an eagerness that amazed him. She was not afraid of hard work or getting dirty. She hauled water for the cattle, mended fence beside him in the frost-tinged mornings, learned to throw hay and clean stalls, and a dozen other tasks that most women of her background would have considered beneath them. In the evenings they cooked together, read aloud from books they both loved, and talked for hours about everything under the sun. They were careful to maintain propriety, at least in the ways that mattered. Hannah slept in her own room, and they kept their physical relationship limited to kisses that grew increasingly passionate, but never crossed lines that could not be uncrossed. It was a sweet kind of torture, wanting her more with each passing day but determined to do things properly, to build something that would last. 2 weeks after that first night, a rider came from town. It was Thomas Burke, the lawyer Hannah had mentioned, a distinguished-looking man in his 50s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. He spent an afternoon going over paperwork with Hannah, explaining the legal situation. Harold Caldwell had been arrested for fraud and cheating at cards. The evidence was overwhelming, compiled over months by Burke himself and several other men who had suspected, but had not been able to prove anything until Hannah forced the issue. Harold was facing prison time, and all his assets were being liquidated to repay the men he had cheated. "You were right about the money," Burke told Hannah, his voice gentle. "Your father had been using your inheritance without authorization. I have frozen all his accounts and initiated proceedings to return your funds to your control. It will take a few months to sort out, but you should have access to everything your mother left you by spring." Hannah took the news with equanimity, though Fletcher could see the pain in her eyes when she learned her father would likely spend years in prison. No matter what he had done, Harold was still her father, and that relationship, broken as it was, left scars. Fletcher held her that night while she cried, not offering platitudes or trying to fix anything, just being there while she grieved the father she had thought she had, and the reality of who he actually was. Winter came on hard and fast that year, arriving in early November with a blizzard that dumped 3 feet of snow across the valley in a single night. Fletcher and Hannah worked side by side to make sure the cattle were sheltered and fed, to keep the pipes from freezing, to maintain the narrow paths between house and barn. The work was exhausting, relentless, and through it all, Fletcher watched Hannah transform from a city woman playing at ranch life into someone who genuinely belonged to this harsh, beautiful land. One evening in late November, they were sitting by the fire after a particularly brutal day. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside the house was warm and smelled like the stew they had made for dinner. Hannah was mending one of Fletcher's shirts, her head bent over the work, firelight turning her hair to burnished gold. Fletcher was supposed to be working on his account books, but he found himself just watching her instead, marveling at how completely she had woven herself into the fabric of his life. "You are staring again," Hannah said without looking up, but she was smiling. "Cannot help it," Fletcher admitted. "You are beautiful, especially in firelight." Now Hannah did look up, her green eyes catching the flames. "Fletcher Moss, are you trying to sweet-talk me?" "Is it working?" Fletcher asked hopefully. Hannah set down her mending and crossed the room to where he sat. She settled into his lap like it was the most natural thing in the world, looping her arms around his neck. "Maybe," she murmured and kissed him. These kisses had grown familiar over the weeks, but no less potent. Fletcher buried his hands in her hair, pulling her closer, pouring everything he felt into the connection between them. When they finally broke apart, Hannah stayed where she was, her head resting on his shoulder. "I love you," she said quietly. "I know it is fast, I know people will say it is too soon, but I do. I love you, Fletcher." Fletcher felt like his heart might burst from his chest. He had been holding the words back, afraid of scaring her, afraid of moving too fast. But hearing her say them first, feeling the truth of them in every line of her body, broke down the last of his restraint. "I love you too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I think I have loved you since you sat down at that card table and gambled everything for a stranger. You are the bravest, most amazing woman I have ever known, and I love you more than I thought it was possible to love anyone." Hannah pulled back enough to look at him, and there were tears on her cheeks, but she was smiling so wide it looked like it must hurt. "We really are doing this backwards, are not we? Most people date for years before they move in together." "We are not most people," Fletcher pointed out. "We are us, and us seems to work just fine." "Better than fine," Hannah agreed. She kissed him again, soft and sweet this time. "So what happens now? Do we just keep going like this? Because I am not complaining, but eventually people are going to start asking questions. You know they already are in town." Fletcher had been thinking about this, turning it over in his mind for days. He had known what he wanted to do for a while now, but he had been waiting for the right moment. He gently moved Hannah off his lap, ignoring her sound of protest, and crossed to his bedroom. From the top drawer of his dresser, he pulled out a small wooden box, worn smooth with age. Inside was a ring, simple gold with a small diamond. His mother's wedding ring. His father had given it to Fletcher before he died, telling him to save it for someone special. When he came back to the main room, Hannah was standing by the fire, watching him with wide eyes. Fletcher crossed to her, dropped to one knee, and opened the box. "Hannah Lawson," he said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. "I know we have only known each other a few weeks. I know this is fast by any reasonable standard. But I also know I have never been more sure of anything in my life. You are my best friend, my partner, the love of my life. Will you marry me?" Hannah pressed both hands to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. For a terrible moment, Fletcher thought she was going to say no, that it was too soon, that he had ruined everything. Then she nodded, so hard her whole body shook, and dropped to her knees in front of him. "Yes," she gasped. "Yes, absolutely yes, I will marry you." Fletcher's hands were shaking as he slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, like it had been made for her. Hannah stared at it for a moment, then launched herself at him, and they tumbled to the floor in a tangle of limbs and laughter and kisses. They lay there on the rug in front of the fire, holding each other, and Fletcher felt a peace settle over him that he had never known before. This was right. This was meant to be. Every choice, every step, every card played had led him to this moment, this woman, this future stretching out bright and full of promise. They were married 2 weeks later, in a simple ceremony at the church in Lusk with Thomas Burke and a handful of ranchers whose properties Hannah had helped save as witnesses. Hannah wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself, and Fletcher wore his best suit, carefully brushed and pressed. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Fletcher kissed his bride, there was not a dry eye in the house, including his own. The wedding night was everything Fletcher had dreamed and more. Hannah came to him with trust and love shining in her eyes, and he treated her with all the tenderness and reverence she deserved. They explored each other slowly, learning the landscape of each other's bodies, finding joy and pleasure in the intimacy they had waited for. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed that had been his father's, and Fletcher felt his parents' presence like a blessing. They would have loved Hannah, would have welcomed her as the daughter they never had. Winter deepened, and Fletcher and Hannah settled into married life. The ranch became truly theirs, not just his with her as a guest, but a partnership in every sense. Hannah proved to have a head for numbers and took over the account books, finding ways to economize that Fletcher had never thought of. She also had ideas about expanding, about breeding better cattle, about improvements to the house and barn. Some of her ideas Fletcher had to talk her down from as too expensive or complicated, but others they implemented together, and he watched his operation improve under her influence. Spring came eventually, as it always did, melting the snow and turning the valley green. The cattle grew fat on new grass, and the heifer they had saved in the fall gave birth to another calf, this one without complications. Hannah's money was finally released to her control, a substantial sum that gave them financial security Fletcher had never dared hope for. But they kept living simply, putting most of it aside for the future, for expansion, for the children they both wanted. Those children came in time. Their first was born the following winter, a son they named Jacob after Fletcher's father. Fletcher held his son for the first time with tears streaming down his face, awed by the tiny perfect creature he and Hannah had created. Hannah, exhausted but glowing, watched her husband fall in love with their baby and felt her heart overflow. This was what her mother had wanted for her, she knew. Not wealth or status or social position, but love. Real, deep, abiding love and the family that could grow from it. Jacob was followed 2 years later by a daughter they named Rose, after Hannah's mother. Then another son, William, and finally another daughter, Clara. The house Fletcher's father had built grew crowded with life and laughter, with children running through rooms that had been silent for too long, with love that overflowed every boundary and limitation. The years passed in the way they do, when life is good, quickly but full. Fletcher and Hannah worked the ranch together, raised their children, became pillars of the community. The story of how they met became local legend, told and retold until it took on mythic proportions. The woman who walked into a saloon and brought down a crooked gambler. The man who bet everything on a single hand of cards. The love that grew from impossible circumstances into something lasting and true. Harold Caldwell served 5 years in prison and emerged a broken man. He wrote to Hannah once, a letter full of regret and apology, asking if he could meet his grandchildren. Hannah agonized over the decision for weeks, and it was Fletcher who finally helped her see clearly. Forgiveness did not mean forgetting, he said, and it did not mean giving someone the power to hurt you again. But it did mean being willing to try, carefully, to rebuild something from the ruins. They invited Harold to the ranch for Christmas when Jacob was 5. It was awkward at first, everyone walking on eggshells. But Jacob, with the innocent directness of children, climbed right into his grandfather's lap and demanded a story. And Harold, looking at his daughter's family, at the life she had built, at the happiness shining from her face, broke down and wept. He apologized, really apologized, taking full responsibility for his actions and the pain he had caused. It did not fix everything, could not erase years of damage, but it was a start. Harold never quite became part of their inner circle, but he became a presence in their lives, a sometimes grandfather who visited occasionally and always brought gifts for the children. He never gambled again, taking work as a bookkeeper in Cheyenne, living simply and quietly. Fletcher watched Hannah carefully during those early visits, ready to step in if her father hurt her again, but Harold seemed genuinely changed. Prison and the loss of everything he had valued had broken something in him, but it had also opened his eyes to what actually mattered. The ranch prospered beyond Fletcher's wildest dreams. With Hannah's business acumen and his knowledge of cattle and land, they built something substantial, something that would last for generations. They bought more land, improved their herd, built a bigger barn and a bunkhouse for the hands they eventually had to hire as the operation grew. But no matter how successful they became, they never forgot where they started. Every year, they hosted a dinner for all the ranchers whose properties Hannah had helped save, a reminder of the community bonds that held them all together. Their children grew up strong and capable, taught by both parents to work hard, to treat others fairly, and to never take their good fortune for granted. Jacob inherited his father's quiet strength and his mother's head for business. Rose had Hannah's fierce independence and Fletcher's gentle heart. William was all mischief and laughter, keeping everyone on their toes. And Clara, the baby, had a gift with animals that made even the most stubborn horse or cow docile in her presence. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Fletcher and Hannah rode out to the spot where they had saved the heifer and her calf all those years ago. The children were old enough to manage for a day, and they wanted time alone, just the two of them, to remember and reflect. They spread a blanket on the grass, now lush with summer growth, and lay side by side looking up at the endless Wyoming sky. "Do you ever think about that night?" Hannah asked, lacing her fingers through Fletcher's. "The card game, how different everything could have been." "All the time," Fletcher admitted. "If your father had won honestly, if you had not walked through that door when you did, if I had been too proud to accept your help, so many ways it could have gone wrong. But it did not," Hannah said. She rolled onto her side, propping herself up on one elbow to look down at him. 20 years had added lines around her eyes and threads of silver in her honey-colored hair, but to Fletcher, she was more beautiful now than she had been at 21. It went exactly right. "We found each other, Fletcher. Against all odds, in the most impossible circumstances, we found each other." Fletcher reached up and cupped her face, drawing her down for a kiss that still, after 20 years and 4 children and countless days of hard work and good times and bad, made his heart race. "Best hand I ever lost," he murmured against her lips. Hannah laughed, that same joyful sound that had filled his house with light all those years ago. "Best bet I ever made," she agreed. They stayed there until sunset, talking about the past and the future, about their children and their dreams, about all the ways their life together had exceeded anything either of them could have imagined. As the sky turned gold and pink and purple, Fletcher pulled Hannah close, tucking her against his side, and felt grateful beyond words for every moment that had led them here. The years continued to unfold. Jacob married a smart woman from town and brought her to live on the ranch, learning from Fletcher how to manage the operation he would one day inherit. Rose shocked everyone by announcing she wanted to be a teacher and left for college in Denver, returning summers to help on the ranch, and fill the house with stories of city life and her studies. William, restless and adventurous, signed on with a cattle drive heading to Montana, promising to return but needing to see the world first. And Clara, at 16, was already showing signs of following in her mother's footsteps, fearless and determined and unwilling to let anything stand in her way. Fletcher and Hannah grew older together, their hair going gray, their bodies bearing the marks of decades of hard work. But the love between them never diminished, never became routine or taken for granted. Every day, Fletcher woke up grateful to see Hannah beside him. Every night, Hannah fell asleep secure in the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged. When Fletcher was 58, he had a scare, a pain in his chest that turned out to be nothing serious but reminded them both of their mortality. That night, lying in bed with Hannah curled against him, Fletcher said what had been on his mind since the doctor gave him a clean bill of health. "I have been thinking," he said, running his fingers through her hair, still thick though more silver than honey now, "about what we want to do with this place when we are gone. Jacob will run it well, I know that, but I want to make sure we do something that honors your mother's memory, the legacy she wanted you to carry on." Hannah was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I have been thinking about that too. What if we set aside part of the ranch, maybe that section along the creek, and establish a fund to help young ranchers who are starting out? People who need a hand getting established, who have the work ethic and the dream but not the capital. We could call it the Rose Lawson Memorial Fund after my mother." Fletcher smiled in the darkness. "That is perfect," he said. "She would have loved that, helping people build something, giving them a chance." They established the fund the next year, with the help of lawyers and bankers, setting aside enough money to help 2 or 3 young ranchers get started every year in perpetuity. The first recipients were a young couple not unlike Fletcher and Hannah had been decades earlier, full of dreams and determination but short on resources. Fletcher and Hannah attended the signing ceremony where the couple received their first herd and equipment, and Hannah had to wipe away tears watching the young woman's face light up with hope and gratitude. More years passed. Jacob and his wife gave Fletcher and Hannah grandchildren, beautiful babies who called them Grandpa and Grandma, and filled their later years with joy. Rose married a professor she met in Denver and settled there, but she came home often, bringing her own children to run wild on the ranch the way she once had. William eventually returned from his wandering, scarred and weathered but happy, with tales of adventure that kept the grandchildren spellbound. He took over managing the hands and the day-to-day operations, leaving Jacob free to handle the business side. And Clara, surprising no one, became a veterinarian, one of the first women in the territory to do so, and set up practice in Lusk, caring for ranch animals throughout the county. On their 40th wedding anniversary, the whole family gathered at the ranch for a celebration. 3 generations filled the house and spilled out onto the porch and yard. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, stories told and retold until everyone knew them by heart. As the sun set over the valley, Fletcher stood on the porch watching his family, his legacy, everything he and Hannah had built together. Hannah came to stand beside him, sliding her arm around his waist. She was 71 now, her hair completely white, her face lined with years of laughter and tears and hard work. But when she looked up at him, her eyes were still the same brilliant green they had been the night she walked into that saloon and changed his life forever. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. "That night," Fletcher said, "sitting at that card table thinking I had lost everything, having no idea I was about to gain everything that really mattered." Hannah leaned her head against his shoulder. Do you remember what you said to me that first morning, when I asked what happened now? Fletcher thought back through 4 decades of memories. I said now I get my ranch back thanks to you, and you needed somewhere safe to stay. Seems like those two problems might have the same solution. You offered me shelter, Hannah said. You offered me friendship. You offered me a place to figure out who I was and what I wanted. And then you gave me love and partnership and this beautiful, impossible life. She gestured at the scene before them, their children and grandchildren, the ranch stretching out under the vast Montana sky, everything they had built from a single night of courage and chance. We gave each other all that, Fletcher corrected gently. You saved me just as much as I saved you, maybe more. You gave me purpose and family and love beyond anything I dreamed possible. You turned this lonely house into a home. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink lower, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Around them, their family continued to celebrate, their voices carrying on the evening air. This was what mattered, Fletcher thought. Not land or cattle or money, though those things had their place. What mattered was love and family and building something that would last beyond your own years. What mattered was finding the person who made you whole and choosing them every day for the rest of your life. Fletcher lived to be 82, and when he passed, it was peacefully in his sleep, with Hannah holding his hand. The whole county turned out for his funeral, testimony to the man he had been and the respect he had earned. Hannah grieved deeply, but she did not break. She had their children and grandchildren around her, and the ranch to keep her occupied, and memories of 46 years of marriage that sustained her through the lonely nights. She lived another 8 years, long enough to see great-grandchildren born, long enough to know that the legacy she and Fletcher had built would continue long after she was gone. She spent her final years telling stories to anyone who would listen, making sure the family history was preserved, that future generations would know how it all started. That night in the saloon, the card game, the woman who walked through a door and changed everything. Hannah passed away in her sleep on a spring morning, with the windows open and the scent of new grass drifting through the room. She was buried next to Fletcher on a hill overlooking the valley they had loved, under a stone that read Hannah Moss, beloved wife, mother, grandmother. She gambled on love and won everything. Their children kept the ranch going, and their children after them, generation after generation building on the foundation Fletcher and Hannah had laid. The Rose Lawson Memorial Fund helped dozens of young ranchers over the decades, giving them the start they needed to build their own dreams. And every year, on the anniversary of that fateful card game, the family gathered at the graves on the hill and told the story again, keeping the memory alive. The story of the rancher who bet his heart on a single hand of cards, the cowboy who lost the game but won the woman, and the love that grew from impossible odds into something that lasted beyond lifetimes, beyond memory, into legend. A testament to courage and chance, to taking risks when it mattered, to being willing to gamble everything for something real in the end. That was what love was, Fletcher and Hannah had learned. The biggest gamble of all. But when you found the right person, when you laid your heart on the table and they matched you bet for bet, the payoff was worth more than all the ranches and cattle and gold in the world. The payoff was everything: home, family, purpose, joy, a life well lived and love that never died. And that, their descendants knew, was the real happy ending. Not just that Fletcher and Hannah found each other against impossible odds, but that they built something together that lasted, that mattered, that changed lives for the better long after they were gone. That was the legacy worth preserving, the story worth telling, the truth at the heart of their legend. On the ranch in Wyoming, under the endless sky, their great-great-grandchildren still worked the land. They tended cattle and mended fences and watched the sun rise over the valley. They told stories around the dinner table about ancestors they had never met, but felt they knew. They maintained the fund that helped young ranchers get started, continuing Hannah's mother's legacy of helping others. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, if you listened carefully, you could almost hear it. Laughter echoing from the old house. The creak of the porch swing. Voices talking softly in the darkness. Two people who found each other when they needed it most and held on through everything life threw at them. Fletcher and Hannah, still present in the land they loved, in the family they created, in the love that had built something capable of lasting forever. The rancher had bet his heart on a single hand of cards. The cowboy had lost the game but won the woman. And together, they had won everything that truly mattered. That was the real story, the one that would be told and retold as long as the ranch stood and the valley remained. A love story for the ages, born in a saloon in Wyoming on an October night in 1884, and lasting until time itself ran out.